Hey there, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about William Burroughs' The Place of Dead Roads. This is a really interesting novel that I started to read a few months ago, and I was not feeling it and put it down. But then the other day I saw it on my shelf, and I was thinking of my friend Matthew here, and he's really into this sort of Western American lit, and I was reading some of the passages and I was like, you know what? He would really like that. And he started reading it and I was like, okay, I'll read it alongside him. And we've been spending the last, few days kind of on our own reading over it, and he's in town with me. So we were kind of talking about it and we had a lot of ideas that we were just kind of throwing around. And I thought it would be really interesting to get a perspective on this novel because a lot of the coverage of Burroughs is on Queer, Junkie, and Naked Lunch, his first trilogy. And not a lot of his other work gets as much attention in scholarly or non-scholarly spaces, and this is part of his last trilogy, which to me has a very different, even from the films like Naked Lunch or Queer that we've both watched together, this feels very different. Even though it has like some of the kind of, his prose feels very similar across his oeuvre, the kind of setting, the concerns that he has are slightly different, and I just think it'd be really interesting to kind of team out some of those differences. So Matthew, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Well, let's see. I am an English student at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. I am predominantly a reader of American literature with a specific focus in Southern lit. We're talking about Burroughs today and this wonderful little novel about the Wild West, but I have to take the chance to talk about my boy.
This is his Finnegan's Wake.
This is is Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, which is, I would argue, when we're talking about this kind of grand idea of what is the essential American novel, I would say this, Herman Melville's Moby Dick, and there's probably another one in there, but those,
at least those two.
Yeah, at least those two, I would say, are the quintessentials for the American novel, or the idea of the great American novel. Mm-hmm. But yeah, this is for sure my Finnegan's Wake. Mm-hmm. This is my 5th summer reading this novel, and I bought a fresh copy that I've been tabbing along. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, and we've kind of been talking a lot about what makes the American tradition what it is, and you have a lot of interests in American theater as well.
Yeah.
In addition to other things, what do you think is quintessentially American about The Place of Dead Roads, and what separates it from like Blood Meridian or Melville or any of these other authors?
Yeah. Well, so what I find interesting here with what Burroughs is trying to capture is this novel is inherently set in the Wild West as we think of it, but it is what delineates it from something like Blood Meridian is Burroughs is trying to capture a different perspective on how we think about the American West, which has been romanticized throughout all of American pop culture with film and in literature and other things that are escaping my brain right now. But what Burroughs is focusing on is the explicit, sexual nature of the West, which is not something that we necessarily see in something like Blood Meridian. McCarthy is focusing on the pure violence of the West and what is going on that front with scalpers and people just mindlessly killing for no apparent reason or thought, where Burroughs has kind of shifted that into, well, what does the sexual look like? Mm-hmm. Because in American film, when you apply the idea of American film and the Western film, a movie about the Wild West is very romantic in its shot and how it is telling a story. It is romanticizing the violence and the hero's the savior idea, not the sexualness. The guy gets the girl, but you see a lot in Western films when it comes to sexual explicitness, you have these shots, and I was talking to you about this yesterday.
Yeah.
You have these shots of, you know, a man and a woman, and they're about to kiss each other and do the thing, and then they kiss, and it's like, oh, the music swells, and then there's a cut, and then we come back in, they're both like laying in bed, unclothed, you know, the sheets are over them, and we don't actually see the sexualness of the West.
Yeah.
And Burroughs is completely just engrossing us in that.
Yeah.
Fully.
Yeah. Well, and we were also talking yesterday, the kind of sexual appeal of Burroughs has always been so interesting to me, because I think of the Naked Lunch trial, and I think of the controversy that's always surrounded him. And I had always thought of him as just this like queer icon of like owning his shit. But like when we, like especially when he's portrayed in film, there's all this ambivalence about him, and he's confused. And I don't get the sense of confusion per se in The Place of Dead Roads. Like I get a sense of trajectory. It's sort of owned by that like Western ethos of he loves his guns, he loves his guys, but in a very different way. Because like, I don't know, I think that one of the quintessentially queer things about this is the relationship towards men is one framed around masculinity. Like masculinity is really important, but it's sort of ecstatically explosive. It seems to me that it has a lot of like political implications too.
What I think is how he's kind of circumventing this idea of the West is within Kim as our narrator. Off the bat, a man named Kim already
is already
is
weird.
Already on itself, and in the West is already like a place that is all about this, you know,
bravado.
Yes, and macho-ness, and like you need to be like, you know, rough and you know, kind of a thing. And like when we're introduced to Kim, he's a very strange boy.
Yeah.
Like, but strange in a way that is like not unmasculine.
Yeah.
He kind of reminds me of a very kind of demented little boy.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways.
It's weird that like the gun becomes so phallic for him. You were talking about the fact that measurements continue to pop up.
Where is that?
And that seems to me so interesting, because the sort of conformist side of Burroughs, the sort of bourgeois accepting of his culture, always seems to kind of vacillate, where sometimes he's like accepting these very traditional value systems of, you know, just bravado and masculinity, but at other times it seems like he's really trying to negotiate it. Like there's one point where, you know, he's dressing up with his mother's clothes, and he's like talking about like dressing up as a whore, and then fucking Little River, I think is his name, this Native American boy. And it's just like that, you would never see that in a Western.
Never, ever. It's so much of America's obsession with our past of the West is so much on the violence and what men were doing to each other and to other people, and how we kind of set ourselves up for it. Because you had the annexation of Texas and the Mexican-American War, and kind of the weird end to the Mexican-American War, and how you had I'm reading another a book called Notes on Blood Meridian alongside as I'm reading this. The author's name is escaping me right now, but it was talking about in one of the earlier chapters of that book about how you had these men, the Scalpers, or the Glanton gang, which Glanton and his gang, that it was a real gang that existed, and they were paid by the U.S. government and the Mexican government to go and scalp and kill Native Americans and other Mexican people, and they would get paid like $500 a scalp.
Wow. Which is
was,
significant.
Yes,
right?
it was, and it was a profession for them. But the act of scalping another person is so violent. It's such a visceral thing, and it's a very intimate thing as well. When, when you have someone and you're doing that, and I think Burroughs is really trying to tap into that, the intimacy of the West, and the violence that kind of goes along with that, but really that, what does it look like when we take this idea of just pure and sheer violence, we kind of pull that back and we push forward the idea of the sexually impure.
Yeah, because I feel like the sort of excessive libido is part and parcel of his writing, but yet he wants to keep us at an arm's length because he wants to give us intimacy without a one-way sexual or romantic appeal. So we have a sort of, it seems distinctly postmodern to me, in the sort of denial of depth. I think of Jameson, talking about, history has lost its depth, it's lost the sense of referentiality. It's now as if we're sort of recreating a historical milieu with no past, with only a blank present. And I feel like he's sort of writing that on the page, taking advantage of the tropes that we expect from Western lit.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's gratuitous violence constantly in the book, but it just it's not even like it has the force of a snap.
No.
It's almost just like a tabulation on a roster. It's just this happens.
We were talking, Burroughs' prose is, to use a kind of uncouth terminology, he is edging us along with his writing.
Yeah.
The sexual, when the acts of sex are happening, he really is letting it just kind of grace along, and then he'll bam, 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 and then he'll pull it back out.
Yeah, it's weird because it has a sort of anti-teleological tempo. Instead of gracefully we get all the foreplay and we get all the way through to the climax and then we get the aftercare. No, we get sometimes we get foreplay and then we cut straight to a few hours later.
Yeah. Well, so I've got a page here that I think kind of captures this. This is page 55. Kim feels his flesh melting and flowing off his bones into Den, a choking red tide of lust pulling him forward. Den grinds and spreads his thighs, dropping a folded blanket between his legs as Kim kneels between his spread thighs, his heart pounding, his fingers on Denny's crinkled red nuts, feeling the velvet ache running his fingers up the pink shaft to the translucent red purple head like a ripe cherry. The slit parted as a pearly lubricant oozes out now. He is sucking the head up and down, the still, hot, red smell filling him, feeling Denny's toes and his crotch, a gush of sweet metal taste in his mouth that burns down to his crotch. He is ejaculating on Den's feet and calves, semen dripping down the glittering red hairs. A choking red tide of lust and sweat socks. He smiled an ambiguous invitation, travel-stained by a phantom buckboard, a crumpled figure general store. Lithe, youthful flickering, silver bending over to pick up the crate. Kim could see a pool of black blood reflected in a dusty storefront. As Kim drew closer, the lean buttocks outlined a whiff of brimstone and morning sunlight. Looking at the parted buttocks, Kim felt the breath quicken, and the boy laughed. "I know you." It's that turn where we've at the top of this page here, it's just boom, boom, we are in it, they are there, and then it's Kim could see a pool of black blood reflected in a dusty storefront. He's pulled himself out of it.
Yeah, because it's when he says "I know you," I'm what does it even mean
Right.
to know Kim anymore?
Yeah, exactly.
It's such an interesting switch from this really luscious, languid, very turgid, almost there's so much effort being put into the description, and then a choking red tide of lust and sweat socks. He smiled an ambiguous invitation, travel stained by a phantom buckboard. It's so alliterative and punchy in contrast to that really fluid style. And we were talking about that before, because we were talking about how this compares to the styles of other authors like Faulkner. And I feel like Burroughs has got both that smooth, luscious, liquid style, and also that bombastic, vivacious, 1-2 punch kind of approach.
He very much is blending, and that's kind of the thing, I think, when you're trying to understand where American lit is coming from, and when you're looking at its history, the thing you have to understand is when Burroughs is writing and now, and this is also just kind of like the idea of a postmodern idea is, but especially in American lit, the writers like Burroughs and onward are really just true amalgamations of writers before them.
Yeah.
Burroughs is kind of this perfect storm of Faulkner and Hemingway and Melville kind of all put together. McCarthy is definitely more of a Faulkner and Melville heavy, and not American, but very Joycean as well in his language too.
Yeah.
And just kind of these, when we start moving into the postmodern, we really get these, I would like to call them like perfect storms of writers that are just like these true, like melded lumps of clay of,
because it feels properly object-like, and that, like, it feels like we have a commodity that has been forced through the forces of the market or culture or whatever to, I mean, Burroughs is quintessentially cultural. Like, he evokes everything that's going on in his time, all the angst. You know, at the very beginning, you're going to destroy the universe. What does he say?
You're destroying.
Yeah, you're destroying the universe. What universe? Which is like so angsty and anarchistic.
And what's so interesting about Burroughs is he is also tapping into so much of the queer experience before other authors would even touch it. He is blatantly and in a full frontal way approaching queerness and being queer and being gay.
Yeah.
And what does that mean for me now?
And that's what I love, because he builds or makes room for a space where we can fill that, because he has the sort of minimal, like, libertarian logic of, like, mind your own business is like one of his big things.
Like,
and
who cares?
Yeah, and he hates, like, the idea of a victimless crime.
Yeah.
So he has, like, the minimal fetters of, like, he's also talking about the Johnson family, of this kind of, like, minimally respectful sort of unit that takes care of its own and is honest, but also minds its own business. And then within that space, it's like, well, you can be a mafioso, you can be a gay dude,
you can be a shootist.
Yeah, you can be a shootist.
Go and buy every gun that you can think of and learn how to shoot. Another thing that I was just thinking about with this novel that I haven't asked you about yet is every kind of other cowboy that he encounters in this world is also like queer and gay,
which is weird.
Is really interesting when you look at how most, like, when you think of cowboys talking to each other, it's very like kind of standoffish and like we're both men and we can't, like, I think of the old John Wayne, like classic kind of Western films. John Wayne, very standoffish, like, I don't talk about my feelings or emotions. But Burroughs, every other cowboy that Kim meets is like, hey, I'm here, let's have sex.
Well, and it's funny because they still don't talk about their emotions.
They don't.
They just skip straight to the action.
They do.
So it still has that I don't know, that like phallic power, but they're breaching, like you said, they're breaching into a space that authors before him haven't really done.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting to me is I can't tell if he wants us to feel like there is something genuinely positive about the queer experience, or whether or not it's like a general, like, culture leftover, like a sort of general Because he says on the same page that we were reading from, bright sunlight that is somehow dark like an old photo with a silver darkness of underexposed film, so he can see only a few feet in front of him. That seems like such a densely vivid picture. I mean, literally, he's talking about a picture here, but he can only see a few feet in front of him. So it seems like, you know, he's playing with the sort of dynamics of picture media here and the limitations of that. And it seems like he's almost playing on the limitations of the Western itself, of like, okay, this is the ethos of men are supposed to care for the town, they're supposed to care for their families, but they can't care for each other too much that they want to have sex with each other. Right, they have to love each other enough where like they could fight in a war together and could die for each other,
but they can't
want to kiss each other or anything like that.
No, they can't. And it's interesting in this way that he is kind of pushing and pulling us along with the idea of sex kind of being devoid of passion and emotion and feeling, which is,
it feels very cruiserly.
Yeah, and yes, that is a really great way to put it. Burroughs has cruising cowboys. The cowboys are cruisers. I don't know if people know a lot about cruising culture.
But explain for those who don't, because I did not until he told me about it.
So cruising culture is something that is a part of queer and gay culture that came to its most popular probably around the mid to late 60s and through and up the 80s and 90s when it was most popular. But cruising is the act of two gay men being in public and through non-verbal communication connecting with one another and then seeking out sexual acts with one another. Cruising culture it's
distinctly impersonal.
Yes, it's very impersonal. But what's interesting about it is it's distinctly impersonal, but it is using the most intimate ways in which you have to connect with someone. It is all about your eye contact and like what you're doing with your face and your facial structure and how you're smiling or smirking. Like it is all about the intimate details of the eyes and the face.
Yeah.
But yet it is quite literally, oh, you're gay? Oh, you're gay? Okay, now we're gonna go in a park bathroom and, you know, screw each other, and then we're gonna leave and act like nothing happened.
Yeah. Well, and that's so interesting because I feel like really key to the sort of liminal sense of community that Burroughs is trying to build is the sense of the underground.
Yeah.
Like on 121, he talks back to the rod riding, hop smoking underworld, back to the rooming houses and pawn shops, the hobo jungles and opium dens, back to the Johnson family. And it's weird that he's talking about back to, which has a distinctly conservative kind of ring to it. But it's like, has the Johnson family ever really existed? Hasn't this kind of been shaped by the romanticization of American film and of media, which serves various political purposes of, you know, maintaining women's subjugation and things like that?
Yeah. What you have to understand about the Western, and this also ties into McCarthy's Blood Meridian, and how he, in that novel, is taking the idea of the historical and like kind of teasing it out into like his own grander narrative. And so when you look at something like the Johnson family, or in Blood Meridian's case, the Glanton gang, which was a real gang, but also our knowledge and kind of history or record of them is very shaky at best. It's not concrete, because when you look at the time of the peak American West, or the golden age of the American West, these cowboys and these gangs, they didn't really write a lot of stuff down. They just didn't do that. We don't have a lot of records of these people, out of the fact of like with the Glanton gang specifically, we have records of them turning in scalps, and like there's paperwork and exchanging of money. But outside of that, and we have records of where they went, like the different towns in Mexico and Texas and Arizona that they were kind of in and around. But outside of that, we don't know a lot about them.
Yeah.
They're kind of this weird mystery. So much so that one of McCarthy's characters in the novel, Judge Holden, or the Judge, as he's commonly referred to, one of the most famous literary villains that we know of in America, that we have in American fiction. It's shaky if he was even real. There are very conflicting stories on Holden's realness in existence.
Yeah, and I feel like the idea of reality is so much under question for Burroughs, because you were talking about at the end of one of the initial chapters questioning, like, is it a film or not? The way that his vocabulary works, it's like he'll just erupt into this sort of surrealist, like, okay, is this a framing device? Is this just sort of absurdity?
Page 9 at the end of chapter 1 here, it's stop, my son. No son of yours, you worthless old farts. Kim lifts his gun. You're destroying the universe. What universe? Kim shoots a hole in the sky. Blackness pours out and darkens the earth. In the last rays of a painted sun, a Johnson holds up a barbed wire fence for others to slip through. The fence has snagged the skyline, a great black rent. Screaming crowds point to the torn sky. Off the track, off the track. Fix it, the director bellows. What with? A Band-Aid and chewing gum? Rip it in the master film. Fix it yourself, boss man. Abandon ship, goddammit. Every man for himself.
Which is so, like, it's so quintessentially Western in the, like, anarchistic spirit, and yet it is so distinctly 1980s. It is not the sort of classic expectations we have, because it's almost dispensing with the idea of a concrete whole world that can act as the place that we can live in.
Because Burroughs drops this in kind of at the end of the first chapter, and then immediately on the next page, on page 10, for 3 days Kim had camped on the mesa top, sweeping the valley with his binoculars. A cloud of dust headed south told him they figured him to ride in that direction for Mexico. He had headed north instead, into a land of sandstone formations carved by wind and sand, a camel, a tortoise, Cambodian temples, and everywhere caves poked into red rock like little bubbles in boiling oatmeal. Like, he immediately is like, okay, but now we're in the Wild West.
Yeah.
He's riding through the mountains.
Because he's like totally playing with us. He's like, okay, what can I do to like test the limits of credulity? And you still have to stay on the tracks, because I've made the tracks for you. But I think he's showing that there are all these gaps in our media, because one of the passages that I found so interesting on page 84, I can't remember who's saying this, but he says, faked pictures are more convincing than real pictures because you can set them up to look real. Understand this, all pictures are faked. As soon as you have the concept of a picture, there is no limit to falsification. Now here's a picture in the paper, shows a flood in China. So how do you know it's a picture of a flood in China? How do you know that he didn't take it in his bathtub? How do you know there was a flood in China? Because you read it in the papers. So it has to be true. If not, other reporters, other photographers, sure, you got to cover yourself or cut other reporters and photographers in so they get together on the story. So there's this sense of like a concerted effort of media to give the illusion of coherence in a world where it's disappearing.
And that tracks with this kind of timeline of the West when photography really was starting to come into itself, and that's why we have so many pictures and documents of families and the great American landscape from that time. But it's like, even then, they were slowly starting to realize that you can, like, any image that you produce and put out into the world can be falsified on itself. And Burroughs is trying to I think, tell us in a way that this is a story set in the Wild West, but also it is a complete falsification of what the West actually was.
Because like I was telling you yesterday, it's kind of like the equivalent of Milton talking about Satan.
Yeah.
It's Milton's Satan,
Yeah.
and it is Burroughs's
Yes.
Wild West.
Yeah, and what's interesting there when you talk about Milton is the fact that Paradise Lost became such a quintessential piece of literature that a lot of people often conflate it with actual biblical text.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people do with McCarthy and his depiction of the West and the Glanton Gang and what the West looked like. People often just kind of correlate those things, or when they think about the Wild West America, this is the image that they often are picturing.
Yeah, because I think that's that short-sighted
Yeah.
thing that he was talking about earlier,
Yeah.
this sense that we only get kind of what's in front of us through media.
Yeah. And so it's like you're destroying the universe. What universe?
Yeah,
If
'cause-
everything
yeah.
if everything is a falsification,
Yeah.
everything can be falsified, then what is real?
Yeah.
What universe do we exist?
Yeah, because I think part of like Burroughs's kind of strategy with writing this way is to show us the importance of fiction and fantasy,
Yeah.
and the fact that we do have to fill this world with a number of expectations and conceptual schemes that, I mean, they're not like objects in the world.
Yeah.
They're in our heads, and yet they provide a sort of starting basis for the bastardization of each of the characters.
Yeah.
To be like, well, I don't care about
Right.
that.
Well, because I mean, it kind of tells us that, not to be cringe and talk about the cover of a book, but it really kind of tells us that even in the cover. I mean, the place of dead roads. Okay, obviously the first thing I think of is the long stretches of dirt roads that cowboys, and then literally we've got a 6-shooter and this picture of a obviously cowboy figure.
Yeah.
And so when you look at this, you're like, oh, I'm going to get a novel about the Wild West. There's going to be gangs and 6-shooters, and we're going to fight and kill each other. Well, yes, but also we're getting this deep look into, like, what does it mean to be a queer man? What does it mean to be a gay man?
Yeah.
And what does that look like?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and this is something I've always been curious about, and I wonder your thoughts. Like, when I imagine reading this book and talking about this book and telling other people they should read this book or something like it, or something in this kind of tradition of very excessive, transgressive literature, I imagine that probably 90 to 95% of the population is not going to like it at all. It's going to be too over the top. And I always wonder whether or not Burroughs he had to expect it to an extent, but like I imagine something, like thinking of Milton, like Milton doesn't feel like remotely kind of transgressive in the same way. It feels like something I could recommend to a grandparent.
Yeah.
And they would be like, oh yeah, this is enjoyable. But if I recommended Burroughs to a grandparent, that would go very differently.
Right.
And I think about, like, is he trying to create some sort of niche? Is this supposed to be something where like only 5% of people will like it? Or do you think there is some way? Do you think that there's some kind of strategy that new readers can have going in that would kind of help make sense of what he's trying to do? At least understand it, even appreciate it, not necessarily have to enjoy it, but appreciate it on an aesthetic level.
Well, what I think is important to understand about these writers that we're talking about, McCarthy is also very, this is, Blood Meridian got a lot of flack, and a lot of people can't get into it because they see the violence and that's all they can see it as. They can't look past it to the intertextual of like, well, what is McCarthy saying about the violence? Like, they only see just like,
and why is he saying it how he's saying it?
And it's there's a scene I was telling you about yesterday where Judge Holden, he has this kid on his leg and he's kind of bouncing the kid, and then for no apparent reason he just kills this child. Like, he just kills the kid, and you're like, whoa, what the hell is happening? But that is like, it is saying something deeper about the type of man and men that existed in this time. But it's hard to recommend this book to people because they start reading it and it's very disjointed, and the narrative is kind of like whoa, what's going on? We're following this kid the whole time through his journey, and he's just called the Kid, but we also have this other cast of colorful characters. And when I am recommending literature to people from, let's say, Burroughs or McCarthy or who have you, I hate to say this, but I think an important thing that you have to realize is these authors, to a degree, have a mainstream title that is associated with them, a title that the masses have predominantly read and can kind of, divulge with in their own way. And I think when you're trying to tear and really get into these kind of, I would say, very complex authors and their work, starting with that mainstream novel, if you're going to read Burroughs, you should probably read Naked Lunch, I would say first. Read Naked Lunch. If you like Naked Lunch, okay, then start to sift through and see what other weird novels exist. If you're going to read McCarthy, don't go read Blood Meridian first. Go read The Road. It's his most popular. Go read The Road. Or go read No Country for Old Men. Very famous film, but it was he wrote it as a screenplay, and then it was turned into a film, and then he kind of went back and kind of added more to the book, but it's still but either read The Road or No Country for Old Men. Mm-hmm. Kind of establish what McCarthy is doing, then go read stuff like Blood Meridian, Child of God, Outer Dark, The Orchard Keeper, his kind of more complex novels that are like doing really intense things. And I think that's how people like us find these little niches, though I'm kind of a hypocrite because I just started out with Blood Meridian and then kind of went from there. And this is my first Burroughs. I have Naked Lunch. I have not picked it up, but I have it. But you handed this to me, and I started reading it, and I was just like, whoa, this right here. But I don't think I would have had the same level of appreciation for this novel if I hadn't been someone who
was steeped in all this other.
Yes, because Blood Meridian by McCarthy, Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, those novels, Steinbeck's East of Eden even, kind of have already been doing some of the things that I see within this novel, obviously devoid of the queerness and that aspect of it, because those authors weren't queer, but who were engaging with this idea of the West and the South and the cowboy and the man and the family and masculinity, which are big things I focus on when it comes to reading.
Well, and it's so interesting thinking about how he is trying to construct masculinity or the role of people in general in relation to the government or in their communities, because I think there's a common mistake that people will make. And for example, the defense of Naked Lunch made this in the Naked Lunch trials. They said, well, you find Naked Lunch disgusting? That's the point. It's trying to show you how disgusting it is to be gay and how it leads to sort of like a, this is what it's going to lead to. This is supposed to be a cautionary tale. And I think it's very easy to go off of initial impulses and say, this upsets me, therefore it's trying to upset me in this particular way, and it's trying to give me whatever my initial gut reaction is. And I think Burroughs is so interesting because he wants us to feel that gut visceral reaction to his prose, while at the same time holding our thoughts at bay and letting him take us through a disjointed universe that's constantly playing with our emotions. It's like a very distinctly postmodern way of distinguishing between what is said and how it's said. And the sort of how it's said is so distinctly ironistic. He's, even when he's giving you like a very clear, like in Naked Lunch, he's talking about, oh, I felt the cool chill in my veins when I realized I was a homosexual. And it's like, okay, obviously he's saying something more than just like being gay is bad.
Right. And to that point, I agree that when you read Burroughs, you're supposed to be like, whoa, I feel gross. But you're not supposed to feel gross at the gayness or at the queerness. That is not what he's trying to make you feel.
That is the most normal thing.
That is in terms of a normalcy level in this novel, and I'm sure other Burroughs novel, the queerness is the through line for us.
Like, you expect every time he meets a new guy, oh, he's gonna fuck him, obviously.
They're gonna have sex. That has happened every time he meets a man in this novel.
Basically,
but I completely lost the thought there. Went away. He's trying to not make you feel disgusted with the queerness. What he's trying to make you feel disgusted about is kind of, I think to an extent, the kind of depravity of what it is like to live in life.
Yes.
And live in a life and in a world in which you and your lifestyle are not accepted. And I think you could make the case and an argument for, Burroughs, if you don't know, famously killed his wife. We could sit here and talk about why he did that. We don't know. We'll never really know. But, I think that there's a case to be made that a part of it had to do with his inner turmoil of being a gay man in a society in which he could not exist in a way that in which he wanted. It's why so many, a lot of people don't talk about this, but it's why something like the AIDS epidemic was so intense and kind of atrocious on the gay community, because so many gay men were put into these little boxes of having to hide away everything. And
being pathologized.
Yes, and so when you have a community of people that are like that, then when a disease hits them, then it hits them hard, because it's an in-group of people kind of a thing.
Yeah. Well, and it's so interesting to me because I feel like, when I think about AIDS, for example, and the way it impacts the sort of social expectations of, say you're going to engage in a sexual encounter, and now we have to factor this into our decision and figure out how this is going to impact the precautions that we need to take and all that. I feel like Burroughs' communities operate on sort of basic rules like that, kind of like cruising culture, where you have basic formal strictures to the way you go about life, but with none of the middle stuff filled in. Like on page 93, he says there are habitations, the desolate places, the lands between the lands, the cities between the cities. So he's building this in between kind of liminal space. But he's not filling it in for us, and I think that's what's so generous about authors like this is they make readers do the work. Anyway, we were talking about that. I find more and more, this is a complete kind of not different topic, but I am increasingly finding more and more that there has been kind of this, not death of the author, but death of the reader. The reader anymore does not want to work for what they are engaging with. They just want to pick up their crappy genre fiction, smut, fantasy elf smut book, and they want to read it, and then they want to put it down and go watch a Hunger Games movie. The idea of the literary author has, I think, kind of been very much pushed away, and a lot of that has to just do with the market. It is easier, to say the famous line, sex sells. Sex sells. Pornography sells. Famously, it has always sold very well. And so... And that's why I think Burroughs is so difficult to sell. Because he's not selling you satisfaction.
No.
He's selling you uncomfortability. He's selling you fear.
Yes.
He's selling you confusion.
He is selling you sex that is raw and palpable, and it feels like taking a drink of orange juice right after you brush your teeth, and you're just and there's pulp in your teeth, and you're just oh, is this what sex is really like?
Yeah, it feels like knives in all the wrong places.
Yes, exactly. And a lot of people, they don't want to do the deeper work of understanding that.
Mm-hmm.
They want things to be presented to them on a nice little platter and they're handheld throughout a novel.
Because I think for a lot of people, it makes them uncomfortable to think about that a book might occupy their mind for weeks, that it might fundamentally change them.
Yeah.
It's really easy to commodify something that fills a sort of basic need gap and then can be siphoned on and replaced with something else metonymically.
Yeah.
But I feel like Burroughs and authors like him, I'm thinking Pynchon, Miller, McCarthy too, Joyce, all of these people force us to stay in their works for longer than we might like to. I mean, I feel like this book just feels long. It feels arduous. It feels like the pages take a long time to get through.
Yeah, and so much so that I think of these TikTok, but a subculture of that book talk culture. These people that their entire job is to read like 400 books a year, and they read a book a day, and they just... I'm like, I don't know how you do that. And some of them, they'll like pick up a classic, and they'll read it in a day.
Like War and Peace.
Yeah, and then they're done with it, and I'm like a novel that is... I recently saw, if you've ever been to a Barnes & Noble, they have this little section. It's called the book talk section. It's a little table, and they have all the books that are famous on book talk. And not to throw this back into shot, but this was on it, Blood Meridian. And I was sitting there baffled because I'm like, who out here is reading Blood Meridian in a day and then just putting it down and walking away from it?
Yeah.
You can't do that.
I mean, it's like being raped and then just being like, oh, I'll just go do something else. It's like, no. That occupies your mind for your life.
Exactly. Like, they're books that I read years and years and years ago still occupy my mind. My favorite book has changed, but my previous favorite book of all time was The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I still think about that novel today.
Yeah.
I still think about some of the things in there, and I'm like, huh, that's really interesting. Or I'll read something in another novel, and I'll be like, I can see kind of a connection there. There's different things. There are little crumbs in the American novel that kind of exist in every American novel, I would say.
Yeah.
And when you are reading a lot of American lit, you start to realize those things. But you have to sit in texts and really tear and mull over them to realize those things.
Because American literature is about trauma.
Oh yeah, it's about trauma, and it's about unpacking America's trauma with itself. Southern lit especially is about unpacking the deep sins of the South, and what we did to other human beings, and the Civil War. And I recently picked up a book talking about Faulkner and the Civil War, and how Faulkner's writing is coming from a post-Civil War place, but he seeps a lot of his novels in the Civil War, and he's unpacking kind of the relationships between black and white people of the time. And Faulkner, I was a deeply racist man. His family owned slaves. He had help around his house many times. I went to his house in Roanoke in Oxford, Mississippi last summer, and you walk up and there's the trees, and you have his house, and then back behind his house is this little white kind of shed house area where the servants and such used to live. But also, though, he was an author who was obsessed with unpacking the relationships between black and white people at the time. And that's why so many very famous black authors like Toni Morrison, Ralph Ellison have really praised Faulkner's black characters and kind of what they are doing in the space.
Well, and that's so funny because I think about, like, you know, we were talking about, like, the token black author that has to be on the back of a book to, like, give it, like, rapport. I feel like Burroughs is, like, not a token queer author.
He's not at all. When I think of, like, a token queer author, I immediately think of James Baldwin. Like, James Baldwin is that kind of, I don't want to say token, because his work is also very important. A great novel that, if you haven't read it, you should go read, Giovanni's Room, one of the greatest queer novels about two gay men in France. And it's just this deeply moving and kind of heartbreaking novel that does have some similarities with Burroughs in that view of sex and queerness, but I think is a little more, I don't want to say palatable, because the novel also is very intense, but I would say a little more palatable for people. But I think that queer authors, they're not supposed to be palatable for people. I mean, our whole existence is not palatable for many people still today, even in 2025. You know,
because it's interesting, because I feel like one of the things that Burroughs is trying to reject is an assimilationist rhetoric that says that the goal of the queer community is to become normal. I don't think he wants to be normal at all. I think he sees normality. I mean, he talks about the right virus later in the novel, where, like, this idea of rightness and of duty and virtue and all this is a virus that invades us.
Well, I think of, it's this, it's on page 53, Kim is talking with, I'm not actually sure who he's talking to. But
As per usual, that's how this book is.
He's talking with someone. Kim, if you had your choice, would you rather be a poisonous snake or a non-poisonous snake? Poisonous, sir, like a green mamba or a spitting cobra. Why? I'd feel safer, sir. And that's your idea of heaven, feeling safer. Yes, sir. Is a poisonous snake really safer? Not really in the long run, but who cares about that? He must feel real good after he bites someone. Safer. Yes, sir. Dead people are less frightening than live ones. It's a step in the right direction. Just like this kind of duality of existing in normalcy, but also not existing.
It's like being on the defensive versus being comfortable.
What I like about that quote is I think that quote is in a lot of ways a good encapsulation of the queer experience. Would you rather be a poisonous snake or a non-poisonous
Because he
one?
talks about biting someone, and that's that. You were mentioning that seemed like a very queer quote, and now reading it back, I'm like, okay, I see that.
It's like, I feel that he's asking, would you rather have to kind of hide and shell away your existence, or would you rather just exist? And, like, is that your idea of heaven, is being able to exist?
Well, and it's perfect because I feel like his sense of, like, himself as a writer and as a persona that we see sort of reflected in the book, there's this sense of, to be queer is to be memorable and to leave a mark. One of my favorite quotes, he says, "The immortality of a writer is to be taken literally. Whenever anyone reads his words, the writer is there. He lives in his readers. So every time someone neatly guts his opponent with my spring knife or slices off two heads with one swipe of my spring sword, I am there to drink the blood and smell the fresh entrails as they slop out with a divine squishy sound. I am there when the case bullets thud home, right in the stomach. What a lovely grunt, and my saga will shine in the eyes of adolescents squinting through gunsmoke. Kapow, kapow, kapow."
I'm glad I also marked that quote too, because I'm something I didn't explain earlier is I'm also a writer, and that is a very
That is a writer's writer.
That is a very
quote.
real feeling about a writer. This idea of just, you're creating something that's going to exist well beyond you, and
it's palpable. And that's what
Yeah.
I like about Burroughs, is I feel like we can taste, I feel like we can smell him,
yeah,
all of it.
and it's like when people engage with your art or your writing, it will live with them, and it should live with them. A lot of people anymore, I think, with just how the world is and everything that's happening, a lot of people don't want things to live with them because everything's already living with them, and so it's like, why would I have more things to live with me? But I think that's a beautiful thing, to have things live with you. I think there's a...
Because I think that's the reality. We live with things.
Yes.
We are not alone, and
yes,
we're not monads.
We are not creatures of isolation. We are not isolationist creatures. We are creatures that thrive on community and connection. Humans are, they, on a basis, cannot be alone. I mean, some people can be alone, obviously, but we're not bred to be alone.
Yeah.
We are bred to seek out others and have community and foster relationships.
Yeah, and that's what I love, is I feel like we can't be alone with this text because it lives, in the sense that Burroughs has lived, and we continue to get traces of him. And I feel like one of the quotes that really lives with me: an oak bench, smooth as amber, seasoned by generations of young buttocks, a smell of stale sweat, rectal mucus, and adolescent genitals rubs out with musk and hyacinth and rose oil. So beautifully descriptive, and so truly palpable. I mean, we see the distinct obsessions of Burroughs. I mean, what are the smells, what are the descriptors that he chooses to leave behind?
And it's taking what I love about Burroughs and many other American writers, and they do this so well, is they take the idea of the mundane, an oak bench just sitting alone, and they make it something that is, when the next time you walk past an oak bench,
as we are sitting on right now,
you're gonna look at it and you go, huh,
that is alluring.
That is
sexy.
Yes. And so I think so many people now have just lost that look of the world. You know,
because we always have to be going.
Yes.
We can't ever stop and think.
Any writers out there, I think a good thing to keep in mind is when you were walking around in the world, in your head, you should always be writing. Every time I look at the trees above us, I am like thinking of ways in which that tree can be described and what is going on with that tree. And that kind of living of the world should also be imbued within your text.
Yeah, because everything is latently textual.
Yes.
I mean, everything has the possibility to disseminate into and invade your consciousness as a text that you have to write.
And everything is a narrative. Everything is this kind of, now, not in like a structuralist kind of way.
Exactly what I was thinking.
But in like, everything is narrative.
Yeah.
You know, there is a narrative in everything.
Because it's both contingent, but contiguous too.
Yes. It is always going. It never stops. It will stop when, I guess, the world ceases to stop for us.
Whenever we destroy the universe.
Or when our consciousness goes away.
Yeah.
And, you know, we die.
Yeah. Well, and that's so funny, as I feel like as we are trying to forestall the end of this lecture, I too think about the fact that Burroughs is always trying to forestall the extinction of humanity. Like he's talking about escaping into space and our spiritual and biological destiny and all this. But it's like that, those just feel like tropes to me at this point, like the way that he's using them.
I really like the chapter where Kim is like, we're reading one of Kim's short stories that he's trying to get published in like Boys Life magazine, and you're reading it and you're like, A, what the hell is this? And B, you're like, this would never be published in like a Boys Life magazine. But it's like, it is a short story that is just like weird sci-fi like tropicness. Like it's just there's aliens and there's this disease and they're banding together to go to space and fight the aliens, and you're like, what is this, Burroughs? Why is this here? But I think he is, in a way, kind of turning the idea of media on itself with us, and this idea of like the grandness in the trope, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because I think he wants to say a similar thing about personality. You know,
Yeah.
insofar as personality is a trope of sorts of this sort of like mythic fullness of the personality of certain characters we get, where we're like, oh my gosh, I can see all of them, but I don't see myself that way. I just see through a little kind of pinhole. I see through the glass darkly, so to speak.
Right.
And I feel like with Burroughs, you know, we're forced to self-reflexively go, okay, well, what are the things that are in my head that are like this, that are filled with tropes and excess and lack of coherence, and they like, maybe there's some like acceptance to be had there. I think that's one of the like distinctly relevant kind of queer aspects, is this idea of the acceptance of the mundane as much as the extreme.
Yeah. And also the just the unabashed acceptance of the self. That
It's properly Whitmanian.
Yeah. Walt Whitman, great American poet and writer, probably the greatest American poet, I would say.
For sure.
He recommend everyone go read Leaves of Grass. It will change your life.
It will.
Especially when you read it, go find a field or find a forest.
Or go have sex.
That too. That works too. But like, I read Leaves of Grass in Indiana, sitting in the middle of a long stretch of just like flat earth. And I sat there and I read it, and I was like forever changed, because something that Whitman does so beautifully and brilliantly is he is fully accepted of himself and his body and his mind and his heart and his soul and his sexuality, and he has just melded all of those things
Ain't
together.
no two ways about it. He's loving himself.
He is, and I think
Burroughs loves himself without even knowing who he is.
Exactly. And Burroughs, I do think he loves himself, but he has buried himself under this mountain of things that are very,
almost impermeable.
Yeah, very.
I get this
very,
sense of
well,
someone so layered.
Yeah, I said it earlier. When we were walking over here, I think I was talking about myself, but I think Burroughs is also like this. He's trying to disseminate the finite from the fluid. What are the finite things in life? What are the fluid things in life?
Mm-hmm.
And where do I exist within them?
Exactly.
And he, I think, rather perfectly and brilliantly has done those things.
Yeah.
Within his, when you look at all of his work, all of his works kind of together, all of those things kind of come together.
Yeah. Yeah. So with that being said, I think that's a really beautiful example of why you should check out Burroughs. Either this or
Naked Lunch.
Naked Lunch.
Queer.
Yeah. We
Also,
both have that on our reading
yes.
list right now.
Also, if you don't want to read queer, there's a really great, I think, film adaptation that just came out last year, directed by Luca Guadagnino with Daniel Craig as William Burroughs, or Lee, as he's called.
The Yahweh scene is...
It is probably one of my favorite movies
Me too.
that I have seen in recent time.
Yeah.
It is great. Yeah.
So with that, go in peace. You can check out any of my other stuff I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic lit. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you just want to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I appreciate anything that can be given. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.